Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. To a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. Now, let's shut the shutters on the 21st century and open the creaking door to a Benedictine monastery in the year, let's say 1153. The precise year doesn't matter much when your daily routine hasn't changed in 300, or will change for another 500. Welcome to the scriptorium, the monastic heart of watching ink dry in Latin. The hour is just before prime, the second hour after sunrise. The bell has tolled, gently, appropriately, and a bleary line of monks in rough wool robes shuffle into place like a cassocked conga line. There's Brother Alric, already muttering about parchment thickness, like it's a spiritual crisis. Brother Godwin, who insists on warming his inkpots with tender sighs. And of course, Brother Oswin, who, judging by the faint yowling echoing from the cloister garden, has again neglected the cat. Parchment lies across heavy wooden desks, a fragrant palimpsest of sheep and scholarship. Parchment, you see, is not paper. It's more ambitious than that. It begins life as a sheep who, regrettably, becomes part of the enlightenment process through no fault of its own. The skin is scraped meticulously until it's thin, smooth, and acceptably dead. Then it's rubbed with pumice and chalk, producing a surface so soft even your dreams might envy it. This morning, Brother Oswin is assigned to copy the homilies of St. Augustine by candlelight, dim enough to sue for negligence. He dips his quill into ink made from oak gall and the tears of utterly defeated scribes. The first letter, a grand looping Q, is adorned with a snarling wolf, a faintly dyspeptic angel, and something that might be a cabbage, or might be the monk's attempt at a lion. Illumination, it's called. Often less about shedding divine light, and more about killing time in a holy manner. The rhythm of life in the scriptorium is exquisite in its monotony. Write, pause, blow on the ink, cough discreetly, chant a psalm under your breath, swat at the scriptorium cat, who has now leapt onto the manuscript and is staring deeply into your soul as if to say, you shall never finish your marginalia. By late morning, the air is thick with candle smoke and ecclesiastical stress. Brother Alric is furrowing his brow over a disputed abbreviation. Was it IHC for Jesus or IHC for in hoc capitulo? He mutters something that toes the line between exasperation and heresy. No one corrects him. In these hallowed halls, the art of copying is taken very, very seriously. A smudged word could lead to theological drift, or worse, an irate abbot. Heaven forbid you skip a line and claim that St. Paul recommends moderate gambling and regular ale. Monks wrote bent over, wooden desks built at unsettling angles, designed to encourage humility and discourage comfort. The act of copying was both a spiritual offering and an occupational hazard. Many scribes became wonderfully nearsighted, partially hunched, and deeply, gloriously boring. The hours pass slowly. Light shifts across the stone floor, catching in the motes of dust that dance like medieval disco. A bell rings for the midday meal. Vegetable pottage again. Brother Godwin grumbles that last week's pottage blinked at him. Everyone chuckles piously and decides to pretend it didn't. Even food, you see, is a lesson in restraint, unless it's feast day, in which case cheese becomes a theological argument. After eating, the scribes return for another rotation at the manuscript mines. The cat, finally appeased with a shred of fish, or perhaps divine forgiveness, curls up under the desk. Brother Oswin, quill in hand, sighs softly, and resumes his sacred art. A capital D this time, adorned with a dancing bishop and what is absolutely definitely not a duck wearing a crown. And so, the day unspools like ink from a well. Nothing changes, and yet everything matters. You might call it boring, but really, it's just quiet excellence, practiced daily, wrapped in wool and honest repetition. So remember, if you think your job is dull, at least you don't have to debate Latin prepositions with a cat on your manuscript. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. The sun had barely bothered to peek above the terracotta rooftops of Thebes when our scribe, Menemope, yes, still him, still decidedly unfamous, shuffled from his modest clay-washed dwelling. The sky glowed with that subdued apricot hue ancient Egyptians might have poetically compared to the inside of a cantaloupe, had cantaloupes existed in New Kingdom Egypt. He tightened the linen sash of his white tunic, a fashion statement that hadn't budged in centuries. In this era, style changes moved more slowly than a papyrus reed growing in autumn. But at least the monotony saved Amenemope the headache of wondering what to wear each day. In one hand, he carried a small satchel containing his most treasured instruments, a reed brush carved to precise softness, a little palette with slots for black and red ink, and a sacrificial snack, dried figs slightly over firm. No breakfast yet. Scribes were not kings after all. As he made his way through the narrow alleyways, dusty with the morning hush of soon-to-be bustling Theban life, he passed neighbours engaging in their own pre-coffee rituals. A laundrywoman fluffed linen on a rope line stretched confidently between two mud-brick walls. A potter's apprentice yawned insistently while hauling amphorae from yesterday's kiln, and somewhere behind a half-open reed door, a baby expressed strong opinions about being awake before the sun was truly committed. At the temple complex, yes, the temple, a radiant sprawl of columns and courtyards with oddly dependable pigeons roosting wherever reverence permitted, the real work began. Amenemope wasn't employed by the gods precisely. It was more of a long-term freelance situation. His patron priest, Parza, was in need of bureaucratic brilliance and legible handwriting. And Amenemope, for all his other failings, awkward small talk, incessant papyrus snacking, had mastered the art of hieratic script. Quicker than hieroglyphs, hieratic was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of cursive. Beautiful, even messy in a controlled chaos sort of way, like someone scribbling poetry on parchment during a chariot ride. Today's tasks were not what one might call thrilling, or even interesting. First on the divine to-do list, copying a list of grain rations for temple workers. Not glamorous, but frankly, the work that kept the Nile-fed food chain from completely unraveling. He unrolled a fresh piece of papyrus, brushing away a fleck of morning dust that had likely seen the reign of 3 pharaohs by now. With a rhythmic dip-dip swoosh, he began to write. Grain for caretakers. 3 hekat. Grain for guards. 4 hekat. Grain for the one guy who insists the gods speak only to him during thunderstorms. 2 hekat and a warning. By midday, Amenemope had recorded 2 full rations logs, noted the reopening of a lowly scribal complaint, likely about stylus theft, and reorganized the temple scroll cabinet after someone had the gall to alphabetize by the wrong dynasty. Lunch came as a welcome interruption. He sat in the shade behind a column, savoring his figs and a small cake made of dates and honey. Perhaps the most exciting part of his day. And yet, even this quiet moment had depth. Flavors passed down by thousands of years, prepared in the same way his mother had, and her mother before her. Mundane, yes, but heartwarmingly repetitive. The temple buzz amplified in the afternoon heat, priest chanting, acolytes scurrying, and somewhere in the background, a goat refusing to obey anything less than direct orders from Amun himself. Amenemop returned to his scrollwork, now tasked with recording an account of offerings made late in the evening prior. Pigeon, incense, a loaf shaped suspiciously like something leavened out of revenge. Every item needed to be inscribed perfectly, or the high priest might throw a modest but disapproving tantrum that could last several days. He worked with care, each stroke meant to last centuries. Ironic, given these records would probably be poured through by a bored apprentice in 200 years looking for something inspirational. By the time the sun began its dignified descent beyond the desert hills, Amenemop finally capped his brush and stretched his shoulders with a gentle grimace. Another day, another scroll finished, another population successfully informed about grain, pigeons, and the glories of temple snack accounting. Torchlight flickered in temple sconces as he made his way home, walking slowly, not from fatigue, but from a deliberate savouring of the cool dusk. Evening was his favourite time, when the air was gentler and Thebes hummed in a lower, sleepier key. Tomorrow, perhaps, he'd begin the grand scroll of nilometer readings from Elephantine. But tonight, there was warm beer, a soft woven mat, and maybe, just maybe, a dream about not having to write the word Hekat 16 times in a row. The moon climbed slowly, spilling quiet silver between mud brick homes, as our scribe slipped into shadow and story, parchment dreams waiting just beyond sleepfall. The goose feather was not cooperating. It never did before the third hour of the day, no matter how much the scribe coaxed it. There was something about a quill at dawn that felt a bit offended, as if the feather had planned a quiet retirement and now found itself dipped repeatedly in soot-black ink, like a disgruntled actor forced into yet another matinee. Aurelius, faithful servant to parchment and scroll, nudged the tip against a scrap of wood, sharpening it more out of fidgeting than necessity. The sunlit dust in the air swirled around him like lazy spirits, and somewhere beyond the high stone window, an ox, possibly named Marcus Maximus of the Faith, though no one quite remembered which ox they were on, let out a groan echoing the feeling of every overworked soul in the scriptorium. It was a scriptorium, yes, but not the magnificent, candle-lit chambers of myth where monks whispered Greek philosophy into shimmering vellum. No, this was the back room of a provincial Roman records office, where excitement peaked around the third mention of a tax on olive pits, and although he wore the official librarian's tunic, dyed a dull shade of brownish reliableness, Aurelius was no starry-eyed scholar. He chronicled grain shipments. He logged the height and sheen of fish caught in tributaries. Once, thrillingly, he copied a letter about sewage renovations in a small town near Brundisium. Let us not forget the ink itself, a potion of vinegar, iron salts and soot that relieved itself in small black explosions at the faintest provocation. And Aurelius, in a dance refined by months of drudging repetition, dabbed the errant blobs with breadcrumbs. This was the great secret of ancient bureaucracy. Ink blotters were yesterday's stale crusts. Time in the scriptorium measured itself not in hours, but in the number of clerks who dozed off and jerked awake again with half-formed Latin curses. One such fellow, Crispinus the Younger, so called because Crispinus the Elder had once spilled wine on an entire week's records, was currently slumped over a papyrus register, breathing heavily onto a list of municipal sewer inspections. Aurelius resisted sleep not through sheer willpower, but through the unrelenting dullness of the work. There came a point, you see, where the human brain, when fed a steady diet of tax codes and barley weights, simply hovered in some ambient state just above sleep, neither fully dreaming nor fully awake, like a philosophical fog. His current assignment was no exception. He was copying and somewhat embellishing an export manifest from Egypt to Hispania. Dried figs, dyed linen, a small idol of the god Bez with a rather cheeky expression. It was all faintly amusing until again, overwhelmingly ordinary. And then, mid-scroll and mid-yawn, his quill snagged on a stray fibre in the papyrus and tore through figs altogether. There was no going back. He simply crossed it out, added a quiet sick, and hoped the merchants of Hispania weren't feeling peckish. Outside, the day was warming into a tepid nothing. You could tell the time by the smell. Early morning was damp stone and faint sheep. Mid-morning was baked ink and men's sandals. And by noon, it would become unmistakably the hour of roast onions from the nearby tavern. Lunch, of course, was highly regulated. The scribes all ate together at a long, splintery table once designed for 20, but expanded over the years with a curious sense of compromise. Books used as wedges, a cartwheel supporting one end. They discussed only the most vital issues: who left crumbs in the ink lid again, and whether Cicero's grammar was overcomplicated on purpose. Aurelius found himself nibbling absently on a cheese-dried fig bread, which may or may not have been officially exported, and staring out through the dust-cluttered window. A lone pigeon had landed atop the statue of Minerva, looking rather pleased with itself. And though the routines blurred together, this moment, bread tucked in one hand, quill still faintly inked, thoughts drifting between Bez and barley, held a strange serenity. Not every day was about scrolls. Some days were about the slow, deliberate way the sun moved from one side of the sandstone wall to the other, touching the edge of history without ever hurrying. As the pigeon fluffed and blinked into the cloudless sky, Aurelius returned to his bench, blotting breadcrumbs at the ready. And somewhere in the next room, the head scribe cleared his throat with a thunderous ceremony unique to men who believe they're about to say something profound, but absolutely aren't. It was time, once again, for dictation. Possibly concerning water licenses. Possibly, the gods be kind, about a dispute involving goats. Either way, Aurelius dipped his quill, blinked at the page, and prepared to receive the next monumentally unimportant decree, on which empire after empire would pretend to balance. By the time the roosters of Thebes had given up their third and loudest warning that the sun was indeed climbing the same eastern sky it always did, our scribe was already deep into his most arduous morning ritual. Not enlightenment, not papyrus. Breakfast. Picture a modest open courtyard, latticed by slanting sunlight, and a perpetually confused cat that wasn't quite sure it liked the humans who fed it. Here, Seckham scribbled, furiously, not glyphs, mind you, but mentally, scribbling through every possible excuse to delay the unwelcome business of chewing through grain porridge for the 6th consecutive day. His landlady, a woman of mountainous buns and theological certainty, insisted on preparing his morning meal with just a whisper more enthusiasm than the Nile's flood. The porridge was thick, somehow both scalding and cool, and contained raisins that always tasted slightly judged, as if they didn't want to be in the bowl either. Over time, Seckham mastered the art of eating this breakfast with the same skill he brought to sacred texts, slowly, reverently, and with absolutely no joy. Once fed, if one may call it that, our quill-wielding friend began his short walk to the scriptorium, a space reserved for scribes, senior apprentices, and the ever-present aroma of ink mixed with faintly panicked perspiration. En route, he passed the bakery, already belching out the yeasty breath of fresh bread, which gave him ideas. Dangerous, revolutionary ideas, like asking for something new to eat. It was a cooler day, blessedly overcast, the clouds cozying up with each other like the gods had pulled a linen blanket over the sky. Secum made his way past columns decorated with stories of pharaohs doing heroic things to people they didn't particularly like. Hieroglyphs marched in neat rows across stone walls, some of them his own work. But he no longer read them as words. They'd become old acquaintances you nod at without conversation. Arriving at the scriptorium, he exchanged the usual greetings. Subtle nod to the head scribe, a half smile to the ink boy, and an accepted offering of a small date cake from the youngest apprentice, who had learned that kindness often buys one better seating near the drafting window. Today's task was like most days. Copy an older scroll to a newer one, all while mentally preparing for the unexpected joy of correcting the mistakes a priest had made 3 dynasties ago. The scroll was a temple inventory, a list detailing jars, goats, and sacred combs, which presumably housed the divine lice of Horus. Every line scratched onto the fresh papyrus felt like carving words into time. Slowly, painfully slowly. The scribes worked in stillness, save for a few appropriate ink-related grunts. They were colleagues in monotony, a brotherhood bound by ink-stained fingers, shared sighs, and the mutual knowledge that their meticulous work would one day be unearthed by scholars with unfortunate hats and far too much confidence. At midday, Secum took a break from listing the official copper brooms of Amun's outer vestibule to stretch his back with the gentle grace of a man beginning to suspect that vertebrae were just optional accessories. He wandered to the side of the courtyard where lunch was usually taken. Bread, beer, maybe some lentils if the gods had smiled, or the granaries hadn't been raided lately. He caught sight of an argument in the corner. 2 scribes squabbling in hushed tones over whether a cloud-shaped determinative marked east or blessedness. Secum smiled faintly. Nothing quite like the thrill of lexicographical combat. He nibbled his bread and let the warm bitterness of beer dull the jagged edges of the afternoon. After the break, it was back to the ink slab, gently grinding the pigment, adding that careful droplet of water with more seriousness than medicinal apothecaries apply to poultices. Everything done with purpose, everything done again tomorrow. And so the sun crept its slow arc overhead. Eventually, Secum set down his reed stylus, reminding himself not to drop ink on his tunic like last time. He owned precisely 2 tunics, and the stained one had started being referred to in house gossip as the tragedy. With evening approaching, he walked home past the river. The light softened to that liquid golden hour when the Nile herself seemed to doze. A barge floated by quietly, its sails slack, as if it too had put in a long day of being exactly where it was told. At home, he was greeted once more by the landlady, who had heard a rumour that someone had bought figs from the market instead of accepting the house porridge. Secum, ever diplomatic, offered a fig as tribute, which seemed to satisfy the temple of domestic disapproval. As he settled in, the cat reluctantly climbed onto his lap, surrendering in that ancient feline way that translates to, "I don't like you, but you are warm and slightly convenient." He looked out at the violet dusk pooling over the rooftops, and let the quiet soak in. The day may have been dull, yes, but in its slow rhythm and ink-stained steadiness, it held something sacred. Soon it would be time to rest, but not before a peculiar riddle from a wandering student had begun to tickle the edges of Sakum's tired mind, whispering that tomorrow's routine might be nudged ever so slightly off course. The sun, now a lazy smudge along the Nile's edge, filtered through the high slats of the scribal workshop with just enough enthusiasm to remind everyone it was still technically daytime. Dust motes floated like tiny golden priests in procession, utterly indifferent to the fact that Mena, our diligent if perpetually ink-smudged scribe, had managed to misplace his stylus for the third time before breakfast. We find Mena seated cross-legged on a worn reed mat that knew more state secrets than most palace advisors. Before him was his writing board, a proud chunk of smooth painted wood, now bearing faint but telling impressions of pharaohs past, tax ledgers, and the occasional sketch of a surprisingly voluptuous duck. Ducks, you see, featured often in bureaucratic marginalia, perhaps because they were easy to draw, or perhaps because even civil servants in 19th dynasty Thebes needed some levity. Today's task was what scholars might generously refer to as tedious beyond comprehension. Mena had been commissioned to recopy the regional bread allotment records for Lower Egypt, a task involving 16 scroll sheets, 3 distinct measurement systems, and a suspicious number of villages named after fish. He dipped his stylus into a carefully prepared ink palette, red for headings, black for regular text, and began tracing immaculate hieratic script. The strokes were deliberate, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby hummed with a brush, crackling papyrus beneath the nib, the subtle scent of cedar ink, the quiet grumble of the apprentice Ket, trying to decipher if a loaf and 2 measures was meant to be 2 loaves and a measure. Scribes lived in the constant shadow of bureaucratic ambiguity. Misdocumenting a village's bread ration could, in theory, spark a minor uprising or a very passive-aggressive letter from a local nomarch. Occasionally, Mena would pause, furrow his brow in a display of great historical importance, and sip from a cup of tepid barley beer, watered down exactly to the level of safe but disappointing. Like all good scribes, he thrived on 2 things: precision and mild dehydration. Now, to enter the mind of a professional scribe is to enter a place of remarkable contradiction. It is at once scholarly and sleepy. Ancient Egyptian scribes were not merely writers. They were bureaucratic magicians, rendering goats into taxes, harvests into percentages, temple donations into neatly organized mythological spreadsheets. The midday heat settled like a thick, sun-warmed blanket, and ink dried a little faster than strictly convenient. Mena fanned his pages gently with a woven palm frond, occasionally glancing toward the threshold, where a temple cat named Hekenu often loitered, idly stalking shadows and disapproving of Mena's handwriting margins. In scribal society, margins mattered. A line askew might suggest drunkenness. A cramped bottom row could imply laziness. One apprentice, legend had it, lost an entire month's food stipend after squeezing an official's name into a space tragically meant for flowers. The moral: always plan your papyrus layout first. Mena continued, copying entries like 17 sacks barley allotted to the granary of Kentucky, and 3 baskets of bread delivered by the Temple of Sobek, slightly stale. Such records might not have raised pulses, but they maintained an empire. Between these lines of flour-based arithmetic were livelihoods and grain boats, offerings and tithes, occasional thefts disguised as mysterious loss during transit. As the afternoon languor softened the edges of the day, Ket returned from fetching another roll of papyrus and let out an audible sigh upon discovering that the new roll had been recycled from last year's flood reports. A faint water stain bore witness to the time someone had tried to diagram water levels using fish entrails. Even then, scribes were eco-conscious, or just dramatically underfunded. Mena, patient to a fault, smiled faintly and began scraping the old ink away with a rounded shard of pottery. Recycled papyrus was a fickle beast. Too much scraping and the whole sheet rebelled into shredded confetti. Too little, and last year's disasters haunted your word choice. As shadows stretched longer and the rhythmic hum of the workshop grew quieter, a small breeze slipped in from the river, carrying the scent of lotus and wet stone. Mena looked up, blinking, stretching his back until vertebrae made tiny protests of age. The bread records were half done, his stylus missing again, and the temple cat had curled up in the inkwell, leaving paw prints of disdain across someone's draft poem to Ra. Still, there was peace in the process. Precision was its own kind of devotion, and scribes like Mena knew the world hinged not only on kings and wars, but on careful handwriting in a world of grain and ink. Outside, the last calls of traders faded into dusk. Inside, a new page was smooth flat, a blank beginning awaiting its first line. It was sometime between breakfast and the mid-morning yawn when our humble scribe, Eliades, came face to face with one of the greatest intellectual challenges of any ancient office worker, the inkpot dilemma. Now, to the modern mind, one accustomed to sleek, clicky pens and terrifyingly aggressive highlighters, the concept of a problematic inkpot might seem barely worth noting. But in the 14th century BCE, in the dusty corridors of royal archives in Thebes, it was a minor crisis with major implications. You see, ink was not something you bought in cheerful plastic bottles from cheerful chain stores. No, ink was brewed, by hand, like suspicious broth, a curious concoction of soot, water and plant gum, usually acacia, mixed to a texture somewhere between molasses and doom. And as was tradition, every scribe made his own. Or, if he was particularly clever, like our dear Eliades, he got the apprentice to do it. Red, the apprentice in question, had many ambitions in life, none of which included perfect ink brewing. His mixtures were consistent in only two aspects. They were either too thin to leave a mark or thick enough to require chiseling the papyrus afterward. This particular morning, Eliades dipped his reed pen into what he generously called ink and attempted a test flourish on a scrap scroll. The result resembled a squashed beetle doing cartwheels. He sighed a long theatrical sigh, the kind trained over years of minor irritations. The ink was, once again, too gloppy. "Right," he called out, not loudly, but with the precise tone of a disappointed schoolmaster who had found his pupil attempting to write with soup. From around the corner emerged the lanky figure of Rate, arms smeared with more pigment than the inkpot itself, and hair suspiciously sticky, likely having lost a bet to another scribe about whether human hair could be used as a writing brush. Spoiler, it could not. Rate looked apologetic, or possibly just sleepy. With apprentices, those two expressions were basically the same. "I added more gum this time," he explained, as if he had not added enough to mummify a giraffe. Eliades gave the ink a gentle stir with his pen. It made a sound one would normally associate with clay, disapproving of its life choices. "Ah, yes," Eliades replied. "A lovely consistency. Ideal if I wanted to write in bas-relief." And yet, despite the complaints, the scribe accepted his fate. That was, after all, part of the job. The ink would smear, the papyrus would curl. Occasionally, a lizard would decide your documents were a great place for a nap. Life as a scribe was not about perfection. It was about persistence, patience, and the occasional passive-aggressive sigh. He sat down cross-legged, unrolled the next papyrus in the stack, and began the slow, careful motion of the reed pen. The ancient Egyptian script, what we call hieratic, the more cursive cousin of hieroglyphs, flowed across the page with deceptive simplicity. Each stroke had rules embedded within rules, like a bureaucratic nesting doll. And if he made a mistake, well, there was no backspace, no handy eraser. To blot out an error, a scribe would scrape the ink off the papyrus with a stone or blunt dagger and smudge a correction in its place, assuming, of course, the papyrus didn't tear itself in protest. Today's task was unusually tedious. A copy of an older farm log detailing exactly how many buckets of lentils had been stored last moon. Not last month, last moon. Ancient Egyptian bureaucracy, it turns out, had a flair for poetic dating. Eliades scratched his ear idly, wrote 22 buckets, then hesitated. Had the document said 22, or was it 23? The previous line, now blotched with excess gum, had absorbed the number like a thirsty crocodile. He looked at Red, who was now attempting to measure something with a piece of string and a look of deep confusion. Red, when in doubt. Guess, Red offered helpfully. No, said Eliades patiently. Write as previously recorded. That way the next scribe will think it was their fault. It was tricks like these, passed down from scribe to scribe, like heirlooms made of sarcasm, that kept the records trudging forward. Empires might rise and fall, pharaohs might come and go, but the scribes, they endured, armed with glorified twigs, gooey ink, and the unshakable confidence that someone else would deal with the consequences later. As the inkpot finally glistened in something approaching usability and the reed pen glided a touch more smoothly, Eliades caught sight of the sun slipping toward noon, which meant only one thing. It was almost time for the midday meal. But before that, of course, there was just enough time for the true cornerstone of productivity in any century. A nap, preferably the kind where one pretends to be pondering hieroglyphic spacing while reclining heroically in the shade. Let us join him, shall we? As his eyes grow heavy and the ink dries quietly in the breeze, the next moment awaits, where lunch politics simmer as strongly as the lentil stew, in the hush of a dusty Egyptian morning, as light spilled like honey across the stone floors of the scriptorium. Tehut, loyal scribe of the House of Papyrus Storage, stood contemplating the most pressing question of his day. Which reed pen was least likely to betray him? He had 3 candidates, the stubby one that squeaked on limestone, the elegant but temperamental one that had dreams of being a calligrapher in the afterlife, and an ancient veteran of a reed with a nib like a camel's elbow. Reliable, but utterly humorless. He chose the veteran. Beside him, Hapu, his fellow scribe and relentless commentator on life's minor inconveniences, scratched his ear with a stylus and muttered, "My pen dropped in the ink again. Do you think it enjoys it?" Tehut gave a soft chuckle, dipping his pen into the modest pool of soot and gum that served as today's ink. Black ink in the morning, red ink only when someone important might read it. No need to waste the fancy stuff on temple requisitions or grain storage reports. "Perhaps it dreams of being a fish," Tehut replied, swirling the ink ever so gently. The air inside the scriptorium was warm already, the heat beginning to press against them like an overly affectionate cat. Crickets chirped outside, a slow rhythm that seemed to sync with the scratch-scratch of papyrus against pen. Scribes like Tehut and Hapu weren't just writers. They were the computers of 1350 BCE, except much slower, never updated, and with a tendency to complain about arthritis. Their boss, an old priest named Nebamun, passed by the open doorway, trailing a faint smell of almond oil and authority. He paused long enough to mutter, "The temple inventory scrolls are 8 dates behind." Hapu squinted. "What's wrong with ripe dates?" "They don't help us count sacrificial geese," Tehut said, already reaching beneath his wooden desk, where a scroll of recent offerings lay half-finished, sand still clinging to its edge. The temple's offerings were, much like the temple's gods, predictable. Barley, onions, linen, fowl, all tallied in careful columns with a reverence matched only by the daily ritual of avoiding actual work for as long as possible. Tehut tapped his reed gently on the papyrus, whispering to it like a horse trainer. "Easy now, no smudges." Outside, the bleating of livestock drifted in. Someone was attempting to convince a goat that it wanted to be sacrificed. The goat, audibly unconvinced, protested. Despite the chaos of ritual preparations and disappearing inkpots, one of which Hapu quite genuinely believed was being stolen by a mischievous ibis, the slower pace of a scribe's mid-morning lull had begun. It was the sacred hour of reasonable procrastination. Atestes, time for daydreaming about mythical courtly promotions and fresh ink imported from Byblos. "Have you ever wondered," Hapu said, scooting his stool 2 thumb widths backward for dramatic effect, "if one day someone will read these grocery lists and mistake us for prophets?" Tehut snorted softly, not looking up. "Let them. Then they can marvel at our divine message about flower inventories." The papyrus before him was nearly filled, curling slightly at the edge where the weather had dried it too quickly. His cursive hieratic script, elegant yet scribbled with the steady pace of a man who's known 43 ways to misspell coriander, wove its way into the margins. He added a graceful cartouche for the high priest's name, underlined it with a line as straight as his patience, and set it to dry under a sunbeam. "Lunch?" Hapu asked. Tehut checked the position of Ra in the sky, or lacking any window, eyeballed the shadow of his inkpot. "Almost," he replied. "We need to write one more line or risk angering the gods of incomplete sentences." So they did. An additional note about a missing amphora of beer, possibly ceremonial, possibly drunk by temple guards after hours. The scribes made no accusations, simply wrote what the record required. Absence of beer noted, investigation pending. As the light shifted and shadows gradually recarved the outlines of the room, a breeze fluttered through the hanging reed curtain. Tehut stretched his back like a cat uncurling from a sun nap. Hapu, having drawn a small djed pillar for amusement in the margin of his report, yawned with theatrical flair. "I suppose," Tehut murmured, gathering up scrolls with the care of someone cradling a mildly sarcastic child. "It's time to see what's lurking in the lunch baskets today. Sand-crusted olives and slightly sour bread, probably. But that is an entirely separate culinary saga. By the time the sun finally yawned its way above the horizon, spilling reluctant light over the rooftops of early morning Thebes, our dear scribe had already dipped his reed brush into ink twice and sneezed thrice. Papyrus dust was a silent conspirator in the constant campaign against productivity, not to mention sneeze-free scroll-making. Thutmose, whose name rather grandly meant born of Thoth, was not, in fact, born of any divine ibis-headed deity, but of a woman named Nanette, who made excellent lentil stew and never stopped reminding him to sit up straight at his workbench. He shuffled in the pale light, settling into his niche in the scribal workshop, a cozy cubby packed with scrolls, ink cakes, and stray shavings of broken rush pens, all stuck together with the faint stickiness of a room that had too much knowledge and not enough airflow. Today's assignment involved copying a religious hymn dedicated to the god Amun-Ra, commissioned by a minor temple priest whose ambition to climb the theological ladder was inversely proportional to his knowledge of spelling. Reaction to this text: tepid enthusiasm. But Thutmose had long since learned that the path to divine favor was paved with repetitive refrains and well-aligned columns. And so, the scribe settled into the rhythm of his day: wet the nib, roll the wrist, draw a neat row of hieratic text. The papyrus made that feather-light whisper, like a cat walking on woven baskets. A chorus of scribes around him offered similar noises: strokes, mutters, clinks of inkstones, like a monastery of mosquitoes who'd gone academic. At precisely the fourth stanza, gravelly footsteps approached, the unmistakable rhythm of Menfe the overseer, whose sandals slapped the floor like disappointed applause. "Thutmose," came the voice, always a little too nasal. "Did you record the offering tally for the last lunar cycle?" Thutmose paused, mid-ink dab. He blinked. "The offering tally. Of course. Nothing puts a dent in your creative flow like the sudden recall of grain distribution logs." "Yes, Overseer," said Thutmose calmly. "In triplicate." Menfe grunted approval, the bureaucratic equivalent of thunderous applause. Then he vanished, his sandals slapping their way toward other scribes in need of redirection. Back to the hymn. Line 8. Something about the radiant nostrils of Amun. Egyptian poetry wasn't always metaphorical. Sometimes it was just oddly specific. But within the monotony, there was something strangely comforting. The repetition was a lullaby of symbols. They weren't merely letters. Each glyph was a tiny picture, a small story, an eye, a loaf of bread, a sitting ibis. Thutmose liked to imagine that at some point long ago, the gods of ink and awkward metaphors had gathered and declared, "Let there be overly detailed bird depictions." By midday, the courtyard outside the scriptory swelled with heat, and a lizard slithered into the doorway, pausing as if to critique the calligraphy. The scribes ignored it. At this point in their careers, they'd all seen lizards with very strong opinions. Lunch came in the form of a bowl of barley mash and a fig that had seen better days. Scribes weren't celebrated for their culinary perks. After all, prestige and papyrus dust were considered nourishing enough. Thutmose chewed slowly, eyes roaming the walls of the scriptorium where scribbles old and new had been left like fossils. Some were training marks from young apprentices. Others, accidental smudges from lifelong ink practitioners. One suspicious brown stain was, hopefully, just tamarind paste. By late afternoon, the shadows on the scrolls grew longer and the scribe's handwriting grew weaker. His script had begun to lean, slightly tipsy with fatigue. Time for the final quality check. Each character inspected, each line aligned just so. A crooked cartouche could lead to divine confusion, and nobody wanted Amun-Ra angry before bedtime. Satisfied, or at least sufficiently resigned, Thutmose tied a linen band around the scroll, marked it with his clay name seal, and placed it carefully into the storage basket labelled Praise Songs, Boring. He leaned back, joints creaking like an old cedar beam, eyes closing just for a moment. Outside, the Nile whispered ancient secrets to the reeds, and a cool breeze carried the scent of afternoon hearth fires and distant, slightly overboiled onions. His fingers were stained, his wrist cramped, and a small ink blot had found its way to his elbow, which he would not discover until much later. But somehow, all was in order. Tomorrow, there would be more hymns, more ledgers, more radiant nostrils. But before the next scroll unfurled, there was dinner to be burned and nighttime chickens to silence. The stars were beginning to blink across the darkening sky, as if even they were reading the same scrolls again and again. And somewhere, through the cooling air and the long lull of ink-thick thoughts, another task waited for our scribe. Not too exciting, just numerically consistent. The kind of task best approached with a full stomach and a well-trimmed pen. Let's drift just a little farther into that dusky workshop now, where the ink dries and the silence sets. As the sun reached its smug position high above the Nile, rays of Egyptian arrogance filtering through the reed-grilled windows, our weary scribe, Menenhet, massaged the quill-shaped dent in his right forefinger. The papyrus scroll before him glared back in judgment, awaiting the continuation of a land record that referenced no less than 17 separate irrigation ditches, each numbered, each with its own name. Apparently, you could not own Field 14B without first acknowledging your spiritual obligation to Nile-fed canal, blessed meander of the east wind. Bureaucracy in the 18th dynasty was nothing if not poetic in its pettiness. The scribe's writing chamber, generously called an office, though it shared real estate with 2 cats, 17 stone seal impressions, and 1 enthusiastic mouse, was a quiet haven from the chaotic clatter of temple visitors. Outside, priests bustled like divinely distracted bees, each on a mission to fetch holy oils, tally sheep, or misplaced ceremonial headdresses. But inside, it was quills and scrolls, and the occasional furball on a tablet of tax declarations. Lunch was near. You could tell, not just because Menenhet's stomach had begun to plead its case in low philosophical grumbles, but also because a waft of flatbread and lentil stew began curling its way through the papyrus-stuffed air. The cook, an ambitious young man named Huya, who insisted lentils were the beef of the spiritually enlightened, had once burned incense into a barley loaf and claimed it tasted like the gods. It did not. It tasted like someone dropped their sandwich into a brazier and said, "Let's keep going." Today, however, the aroma caused Menenhet's pen to pause, mid-sentence, just as he was transcribing the name of an ox, whose most notable characteristic was that it occasionally refused to turn left. The landowner insisted this personality quirk be included in the tax document, possibly for reasons of livestock legacy. Menenhet let out a slow breath. What a job. Somewhere between sacred scribe and glorified barn chronicler was his life, inked in brown pigments and ancient sighs. Taking a moment to stretch, Menenhet rose from his mat, the rush of standing after 5 hours seated folding him briefly into a living hieroglyph of pain. He glanced at his ink palette, red and black, like an accountant with a flair for drama. Red for important headings, curses, and the names of dangerous things, black for the rest. Today's scroll had required far too much black and not nearly enough red, unless you counted his thoughts of using red to mark all idiotic property disputes. He did not, but he considered it. As he stepped over the curled tail of his disinterested cat, Baste, a name she lived up to with divinely feline superiority, Menenhet's thoughts wandered to the lunch courtyard, a peaceful square shaded by sycamore trees, whose leaves must have whispered ancient nonsense to each other in the wind for millennia. The other scribes would already be there, discussing ink consistency, like it was a sacred mystery passed down from Thoth himself. He joined them, seating himself gently on the stone bench, its surface still warm from the sun's embrace. A clay bowl of lentil stew, the texture of overcooked philosophy, was handed to him with polite grunts. Conversation fluttered around him. Someone had spilled vinegar on an account roll, another had run out of lyrium gum, and one unfortunate soul transcribed 70 obols instead of 17, tragically gifting a peasant more goats than he had places to put them. "In the end," said old Scribe Heb, with a dramatic wave of his spoon, "we are but the quills of history, bent, stained, and occasionally chewed." The group chuckled through mouthfuls. Menenhet quietly agreed. His life wasn't the adventures of generals or the chants of oracles, but what mattered, the fields, the taxes, the ox who refused to turn left. It all flowed through his hands, ideas inked into time. Even if Scroll 73 was about grain storage anxieties in Lower Nubia. With the final mouthful of Huya's lentil interpretation disappearing from his bowl, Menenhet stretched once more. The shadows had shifted. Afternoon duty called. There were receipts for temple linen to file, and a new novice scribe who had accidentally written a hymn using the list of bakery ingredients. The scribe rose, warm belly and weary spine in quiet harmony. After all, paperwork would never illuminate itself. Back inside, amid the scratch of stylus on plaster, another scroll lay waiting. This one stamped thrice with the crocodile seal of importance. Perhaps it would prove more thrilling. Perhaps. Or, more likely, it was another ox with opinions. And so, with dreamlike resignation and a steady hand, Menenhet dipped his brush anew, as whispers of ink and time carried him gently toward the next task. Of all the grand places a medieval scribe might find deep inspiration, lofty cathedrals, amber-lit scriptoria, or even the quiet company of a particularly well-fed monastery cat, the privy was not usually among them. And yet, on this otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning in 1293, Anselm the scribe had found himself in precisely such contemplative surroundings, seated upon the wooden throne of solitude with both a philosophical quandary and last night's lentil stew weighing equally upon his soul. Anselm's daily routine had long since dissolved into a dependable rhythm of ink, parchment, and aching shoulders, but the subtle ballet of his bodily functions was a dependable metronome in the background. The privy, modest though it was, a wood and stone hybrid with a draught and a suspicious smell, offered a peaceful stillness found in few other parts of the abbey. There, as daylight filtered through the crooked wooden slats, Anselm mulled over the eternal question. Why must the Latin word for bean be spelled 3 separate ways in the same manuscript? Truly, scribal life was less about transcribing holy wisdom and more about chasing the elusive consistency of medieval spelling, a tragicomedy written one ink blot at a time. With this fleeting moment of lavatorial reflection concluded, and his duties, both physical and philosophical, discharged, Anselm returned to his cubbyhole carved out in the scriptorium. There, the scent of ink mingled with the faint aroma of wax and week-old bread crusts. The room was alive with delicate rustling, the soothing, papery music of quills on vellum. Anselm adjusted his posture, which was to say he sighed loudly and shoved a rolled-up cloth under his lower back in the hope that sciatica would take mercy on him today. Then he picked up his penknife, not for defense or excitement, but for the far less thrilling task of sharpening his quill. The modern concept of a keyboard shortcut had nothing on the elegant, glacial pace of quill maintenance. On average, a scribe could expect to spend 20% of his life adjusting, shaping, and otherwise threatening his writing tool with small blades. Then came the ruling of the parchment, lined not with graphite or even ink, but with a faint scratching from a stylus across a lead plummet. Lines were essential to prevent the letters from drunkenly dancing across the page like a tipsy minstrel. Monks were serious about margins. You could transcribe sacred knowledge from the ancients, but heaven forbid your line slant slightly upward. It was the scribal equivalent of heresy. As Anselm drew the first strokes, he murmured under his breath, half prayer, half muttered plea not to smudge the good vellum again. Parchment was expensive. Each sheet came from the skin of a once quite blissfully unaware animal, and wasting a page was not unlike accidentally deleting a sacred hard drive made of lamb. Today's transcription was a homily on St. Crispin, the patron saint of cobblers, and Anselm had begun to suspect, of dry and repetitive Latin phrases. Line after line marched on, each stroke carefully formed in the formal Carolingian minuscule script, known for its clarity and its ability to turn even the most unhinged religious rambling into something that looked like it made sense. Midway through the third column, the ink ran just thin enough to leave his Q looking rather like a confused G. He dipped the quill again. The scribe's ink, a proudly homemade affair composed of iron gall and the tearful essence of many walnut husks, glinted slightly in the morning light. It smelled faintly of vinegar and mystery, but worked beautifully if your goal was to permanently stain everything you owned. A soft knock startled Anselm. Brother Petroc poked his head in to ask if Anselm was free to help rearrange the Psalter cupboard. This was monk code for, would you like to drop what you're doing and carry 6 dozen volumes bound in cowhide down a hall colder than moral philosophy? Anselm, not eager for book-hauling athleticism, replied diplomatically that he had just dipped his quill and the ink was on the verge of becoming inspired. Petroc nodded with a knowing grimace, the kind that said, I once got out of digging vegetables by claiming I was ghostwriting a saint's confession. As Petroc's footsteps disappeared into the corridor, Anselm cracked a finger, blinked 3 times, and resumed his labours, his hand drifting into that hypnotic rhythm, peculiar to men writing the same 5 words for the 3rd time, because the abbot wanted this particular sermon copied in triplicate. Beyond the stone windowsill, the sun dipped behind a passing cloud, casting the scriptorium into gentle shade. Anselm paused just long enough to consider the letters on his page, then delved back into his quiet, beautiful toil. Somewhere nearby, the faint gurgle of the kitchen cauldron announced the approach of the noon meal, a stew of indistinct ingredients, lovingly overcooked until all nutritional individuality had surrendered. Soon it would be lunch, but first, just one more line, and tomorrow, perhaps, just one more sermon. But before that, Anselm would need to endure the great and terrible ordeal known to every monk in the abbey, the midday group reading duty. By mid-afternoon, the scribe had begun what he politely called his post-meridian slump, and what his apprentice called master's very quiet thinking time, which often coincided rather suspiciously with the appearance of a cushion beneath the desk and a faint snore escaping into the parchment-strewn air. This, you see, was a perfectly ordinary part of scribal life in the 12th century, a life ruled by ink, vellum, and the odd nap, disguised as reflection. As the sun moved across the stained glass, drawing slow spinning rainbows over his workspace, our scribe stirred himself awake just enough to reach for a little jug of watered wine. Not enough to intoxicate. Oh heavens no, a tipsy scribe could accidentally record a bishop's sermon as a recipe for boiled turnips, but just enough to refresh the mind and soul for the latter half of the day. He picked up a fresh quill, trimmed and split with a tiny knife. The scribes called it a penknife, a name that would echo through the ages even after most people forgot what pens or knives looked like. With a practiced flick, he dipped the quill into his inkwell. Iron gall ink, an ominous name for something so beautifully functional. Made of oak galls, iron salts and vinegar, it had a tendency to eat into parchment over the centuries. But in the moment, it flowed like quick wit across the page. Or at least as fast as one could manage while wrestling with Latin declensions and intermittent daydreams. Outside, a few distant clucks announced the passage of Sister Agnes and her perpetually misbehaving hens. They weren't supposed to wander near the scriptorium, but they had a thing for chewing on parchment shavings. Just one of the many occupational hazards of the medieval scribe. Ink-stained fingers, scroll-thieving poultry, and the looming terror of the abbot suddenly asking you to recopy the entire book of Psalms because he prefers his capital letters a bit more divine. This afternoon's task was rather more manageable, copying a list of saintly relics owned by the local abbey. Fascinating things, really. A tooth of St. Bartholomew, 3 alleged splinters from the true cross, and what was generously described as the toe of a minor apostle. Though privately, the scribe had begun to suspect that most relics were simply items someone's cousin had once buried under convincing circumstances. Still, each entry had to be rendered with appropriate reverence and clarity. On this day, he was working on embellishing the list with decorative initials. The letter R for relic was given a suitably pious vine curling through the stem and around a tiny, bashful-looking lion. The lion was not canonically related to the relics, of course, but the scribe liked lions. They were difficult to draw, but always appeared vaguely apologetic, which he found comforting. The apprentice, a red-haired youth with the attention span of a gadfly, was attempting to sweep the floor as quietly as a person could, while also humming a popular Benedictine chant, reworded into a folk ditty about cheese. The scribe raised one ink-darkened eyebrow and gave a soft ahem, which in monastic passive aggression translated roughly to, "Please desist before I send you to scrape vellum until Easter." The boy, realizing he had trespassed the thin parchment line between levity and sacrilege, tiptoed himself out of the room immediately. The scribe returned to his work, adjusting the candle just slightly. The flames stood motionless, the air thick with warmth and the gentle scratching of quill on hide. The parchment, taken from calfskin, had the faint smell of cleanliness and time. It had once been part of something living, and now bore witness to words that aspired to eternity, or at very least, an acceptable shelf life in the library. He paused for a moment, listening, not for voices, but for silence. It had a texture to it, like woolen robes brushed against stone. This was the great secret of being a scribe. It wasn't merely transcription. It was listening through ink, finding the rhythm in repetition, and discovering, between the prayers and logs and angular letters, a kind of hush that settled into the bones. As the shadows grew longer, and the lion at the bottom of the R now looked suspiciously like a tired cat, the scribe set down his quill. Another page done. Another step toward illumination, both literal and spiritual. He stood, stretched, and looked out the small leaded window. Beyond the courtyard, smoke curled from the kitchen chimney. Supper would be pottage, of course. Again, everything was of course by now. The ink, the script, the ritual of it all. And yet, in a world where every day was more or less the same, it was the sameness that offered peace. Tomorrow, there would be more letters to shape and more pages to fill. But first, a short walk past the garden to see if Sister Agnes had managed to retrieve her chickens without losing her temper. Again. Let the quills rest for now. The sun has slipped behind the cloister wall, and with it, the need for perfect penmanship. There's much more parchment to ponder, just not tonight. As the sun reached its most judgmental angle, hovering high above the rooftops of Thebes, its rays glowing like an accusatory librarian's glare, Mundane the scribe sat motionless at his writing table, not out of reflective contemplation or poetic inspiration. No, his linen tunic had simply fused to the seat with sweat and stubborn dignity. It was a typical early afternoon in ancient Egypt, the kind that could cook barley on pavement and turn papyrus into something with the texture of toast. Inside the modest scribal quarters tucked between a pottery workshop and a goat that believed itself employed, Mundane kept his focus on the task of documenting livestock transfers, a ceremonial phrase that, in essence, meant counting goats, where they went, how many there were, and who could prove they were the rightful goat owner with appropriate bureaucratic squiggles. He dipped his reed pen, carefully trimmed and chewed just slightly for luck, into a small ivory pot of soot ink, only to discover that it had dried to a convincing imitation of a beetle's back. With the resourcefulness that only decades of marginally thrilling copywork could grant, he hacked it back to liquid with a dollop of water from a clay jug and a faintly muttered charm to Thoth, the god of scribes. It was unclear whether this offering was sincerely spiritual or sarcastic in nature, but either way, it worked. As his pen flowed again, Mundane took a moment to appreciate the rhythmic sound of papyrus meeting ink, a faint whispering scratch, like a beetle composing a sonnet. This was the closest thing to music in a scribe's world, except perhaps for the off-pitch bleating of the neighbor's goat, which seemed permanently convinced it was late for something. Today's particular scroll, 6 cubits long, weighed down at one end by a polished rock stolen from the courtyard garden because it looked like it took notes well, was a record of livestock movements between temples. Not holy bulls or sacred crocodiles, mind you, just a recurring cast of average sheep and the occasional jealous donkey. "You'll want 2 sheep for Amon's procession next week," muttered Mundane under his breath as he transcribed. "But what about poor Seti, who only got a goose last time? No wonder the priests bicker." It was moments like this, mundane, repetitive, slightly absurd, when Mundane felt most at peace. The grand sweep of history would remember the pharaohs with their colossal monuments and eternal posturing. But the real story of civilization, he liked to believe, was written in patient fingertips and precise little marks, and in ensuring, of course, that Nukt 6 goats weren't accidentally sacrificed in place of Anku's 7. He paused occasionally to wet his pen or stretch his back, the kinks popping like pebbles in a jar. Outside, the heat shimmered like a hallucination. Inside, time shimmered too, slipping softly onward in predictable segments. A young apprentice, barely taller than the scroll he carried, tiptoed in with a clay tablet and a hopeful expression. Mundane didn't glance up. "Did you remember the determinative for barley this time? Or did we once again confuse a grain with a god?" he asked, voice gentle with the self-satisfaction of a man whose chief power was his deep familiarity with mistake avoidance. "I remembered," the apprentice mumbled. "That's suspicious," Mundane replied, finally looking over the boy's shoulder. Sure enough, there it was, a barley stalk as clear as the Nile in flood season. He patted the kid on the head, like a surprisingly literary dog. Well done. You're one mistake closer to reliable. His lunch, flattened lentil cakes and figs, sat forgotten beneath a corner of linen cloth. He nibbled absently between lines, inking a list of temple exchanges with one hand while flicking pastry flakes off the parchment with the other, muttering, "Not again," whenever one landed where a goat should be. By mid-afternoon, the scroll was nearly complete, and Menena's eyes twitched with the soft onset of papyrus-induced fatigue. He recited the last section aloud, partly out of habit and partly to entertain the crow perched in the window lattice. The bird tilted its head, unimpressed as always. He signed the bottom with a delicate scribal flourish, finalizing the sacred acknowledgement that 6 goats had gone north, while 5 chickens had come south, and that somehow this constituted civilization. Then, with an exhale that sounded suspiciously like an ancient sigh of accomplishment, he set down his pen. There was, of course, one more duty waiting. The sacred chore of the late-day delivery, transporting this scroll from his desk to the Hall of Accounts, a journey of precisely 84 steps and 14 excuses to pause. But the floor was still warm from the midday sun, and outside the breeze had begun to stir like a city waking up from a collective nap. Before the next scroll could be summoned and the next inkpot stirred, Menena lingered a moment, just a moment longer, over the faint aroma of old parchment and fresher figs. And just beyond the open archway, something curious stirred that would, against all odds, make his afternoon slightly less boring, or at least differently boring. Back in the scriptorium, the day had begun to stretch like an old cat, slow, languid, and vaguely annoyed at being awake. Thin beams of sunlight filtered through high, narrow windows, dust dancing in the air like bored angels. Our humble scribe, whose name was likely something splendid like Osric or maybe Edwine, but let's not commit too strongly, lest we accidentally invent him, settled into his worn stool, which creaked in that particular way that stools creak only when they've fully resigned themselves to a life of bottom-bearing service. Today was Illumination Day. Not illumination in the spiritual sense, though we suppose that had its place, but rather the delicate, eyebrow-furrowing art of drawing tiny pictures in the margins of manuscripts. These marginalia, as they are known, served as both decoration and distraction. And while one would expect grand saints or noble kings, more often than not, scribes favoured absurdly detailed snails, jousting with knights or monks, playing bagpipes from their nether regions. Why? Well, we suspect long hours, short tempers, and no one to stop them. Illumination was serious business. It required pigments, some of which were so precious you could buy a small cottage with a thumbful. Ultramarine, for instance, the astonishing blue, was made from lapis lazuli, mined most often in Afghanistan and dragged across continents like a particularly artistic boulder. Osric, or maybe Edwine, would mix it carefully with egg yolk, a bit of gum arabic, and sometimes a prayer. There was an inherent joy in this part of his work. Calligraphy was the bones, illumination, the soul. He'd already copied 10 pages of dense Latin text from Psalms with the precision of a monk who was both terrified of mistakes and quietly seeking revenge against the English alphabet. Now, with quill in, hand and tongue poking slightly from his mouth, the universal posture of concentration, he began shading in a gilded letter B, the beginning of the word Benedictus. Gold leaf was involved, which made him nervous. It came in whisper-thin sheets that clung to skin, breath, and bad luck. A sneeze could send hours of preparation sailing into the air. The monks deemed the gold a tribute to God, an expression of divine beauty. Osric, however, quietly suspected it was also a trap. Still, he applied it meticulously. A tiny brush, a touch of gesso, a breath held. And then, as delicately as a spider walking on cream, he laid the gold onto the page. It shimmered in the faint light like frozen sunlight. Not bad, he thought to himself, allowing one solitary nod of smugness before checking again to make sure no one saw it. As the day trudged on like a donkey uphill, the monotony was punctuated only by the occasional muttered oath from Brother Conrad, who was still recovering from his catastrophic inkwell spill last week. Incidentally, right over the genealogy of St. Cuthbert. Now Cuthbert had two aunts named Elfrida, who might have been one person or possibly a blot. No one was quite willing to say. Osric's own thoughts drifted, as they often did, to the lives of those who would read his work. Nobles, monks, a future king desperate for bedtime scripture. Maybe, just maybe, some child not yet born would run their tiny finger over the glowing letter B and marvel. Probably chew on the parchment a bit too, but such is the cost of posterity. Lunch came and went, a thin pottage and hard bread, enough to keep the stomach quiet but never interested. The monks ate in silence, broken only by the sound of a designated reader reciting from a volume on proper penance for impure thoughts. It made for a sobering accompaniment to the lentils. Back in their respective stations, the scribes returned with the energy of men who counted their joy in lines and ink droplets. By late afternoon, Osric's hand ached with stately precision. He dipped his quill again, blew softly to dry the ink, and then, on a sudden whimsy, sketched a cat wearing a crown in the corner of the page. Was it an act of rebellion, of sheer boredom? Or was it Osric imagining a world where cats ruled and scribes had afternoons off? He'd never tell. Outside, the sun had begun its slow slide away from the sky, leaving behind violet shadows and the sounds of evening bells. The scriptorium fell into that quiet hush, where the only sounds were scratching quills and the occasional suppressed sigh. More pages awaited, more letters, more wrestled gold, but the shadows whispered that the day was nearly done, and our scribe would soon rest his ink-stained fingers. Not yet, but soon, just after this last illuminated cue, and perhaps, just perhaps, a rabbit in chainmail, because between doctrine and discipline there must be whimsy. As the shadows lengthened across, the stone floor, the flickering candlelight beckoned gently toward what tomorrow might bring. As the sun sloped gently toward its usual golden nosedive behind the terracotta rooftops of ancient Thebes, a mellow hum settled over the scriptorium courtyard. It was that magic sliver of the day when inkpots stopped threatening to tip, wax tablets sighed in relief, and sandals loosened their grip on swollen feet. Our scribe, whose name we still haven't revealed because, frankly, it has too many syllables and vowels queuing awkwardly, was engaged in one of the less glamorous, though no less vital, responsibilities of scribal life. Linen tallying. Yes, linen. You see, not all days were noble dictations of divine decrees or flourishing strokes of epic love poems. Some days were inventory. Every scrap of fabric allocated to the temple needed to be noted. How many cloths for ritual washing? Logged. How many squares of woven linen for wrapping up leftover bread offered to the gods? Counted. How many ragged strips used by the apprentices to mop up spilled black ink after a panic sneeze? Honestly, more than you'd think. Our scribe sat cross-legged beside a heap of folded linen that smelled faintly of beeswax and barley, diligently marking each length with a thin reed pen. The breeze was kind, the flies gave him a dignified radius, and the papyrus didn't curl as it sometimes did when the Nile grew jealous and humid. While linen inventory might sound barely more exciting than watching flax grow, which incidentally scribes also recorded, it had its own poetry. Each cloth told a story. Wear marks from daily priestly parades, hems cooked stiff from proximity to sacred torches, a whisper of burned myrrh still clinging to the knots. Ancient Egyptian society ran on order, and at the heart of order was record-keeping. Scribes were like bureaucratic high priests of logic, caretakers of balance, and occasionally guardians of laundry lists. A soft clinking noise interrupted his tally. It was the sound of an apprentice dropping the copper weight used for measuring standard cloth lengths. The boy murmured a flustered apology and tried to re-tie his kilt, which was threatening to become more of a belt. Our scribe nodded sagely, not saying a word. The age-old expression, measurement before modesty, echoed down from generations of linen loggers past. Linen wasn't measured merely in length, but importance. The temple's finest cloth bore intricate marks stitched by those with nimble fingers and even nimbler gossip. Rumors travelled fast in fibre. That corner thread, whispered to have been woven by a weaver who once lived next to the general, who once nodded politely to the pharaoh. Practically royal fabric, that one. Once the tally was finished, each item carefully jotted down in hieratic, a speedier script for records and other thrilling pedestrian affairs. Our scribe took a moment to recline, fingers ink-speckled and joints protesting in ancient grammar. He stared up at the silent arc of ibis wings overhead. In that lull between linen and lamps, his mind wandered. How many others had counted cloth beneath this same sun? How many of their names were now only smudged glyphs on brittle scrolls? It was humbling and, frankly, tiring. The scent of roasting lentils drifted over from the cookhouse, as did the faint sound of an argument about whether garlic should be crushed or sliced. The temple cat, officially unowned, spiritually omnipresent, curled herself beside the scribe's discarded sandals, purring a tuneless but oddly judgmental melody. He smiled, dipping his pen into water to clean it, swirling the black ink into lazy spirals. The day's work was done, well, except for that red ink correction scroll waiting ominously behind a storage jug. But that was a problem for future scribe. May the gods give him patience. The sky deepened to lapis, and somewhere off in a more prestigious chamber, hymns began, slow and low like the murmur of a dreaming crocodile. Perhaps soon there would be another batch of offerings to record, or a new batch of linen to gauge. But for now, he allowed himself one moment, just one, to not write anything at all. The pen rested, the breeze sighed, and the cat snored. Tomorrow, ink, quills, corrections, and the ongoing quest to translate that one passage about oxen that made no grammatical sense. But tonight there was peace, parchment, and the sleepy rustle of palm fronds, drifting into whatever came next. Inside the low-lit scribal chamber of the temple complex, Anan the scribe was engrossed in a meticulous task of unlikely excitement, copying a tax record, papyrus, ink, and decisions about where to place commas, because yes, even ancient Egyptian scribes, armed with no punctuation as we know it, still had to worry about clarity. It was late afternoon, the time when the Nile breeze filtered lazily through the open shutters and the sun dipped low enough to bathe everything in golden tones so overwhelmingly sleepy they practically hummed lullabies. Anen paused in his writing, received 1 sack of barley from Serf Nag in compensation for oxen borrowed, and dipped his reed quill into a tiny pot of soot-based ink, made more or less by burning stuff and hoping for the best. Ink wasn't just a tool. It was a mixture of craft and guesswork, a small miracle that didn't smear when the chief pre-sneezed during document inspection. Anen took pride in preparing it, mixing the soot with water and gum arabic in what was basically the scribal equivalent of a barista's frothing technique. Not too thin, not too thick, just right to glide over the gritty papyrus surface without tearing it. It was an art and a gamble every time. Behind him, the courtyard buzzed with faint sounds, barefoot novices stumbling over memorized prayers, the slap of sandals against dusty tiles, and once, briefly, the unmistakable yawn of a temple cat flopping directly onto a freshly inked bank ledger. That cat, whose name, for reasons nobody remembered, was Treasurer, was well acquainted with Anen's scrolls and had more or less declared the scroll storage room its private sunning palace. Anen returned to work, his hand moving steadily, forming lovely hieratic script, which flowed like cursive but with extra flair and just enough crypticism to ensure later scribes would curse him under their breath during translation. The day's scroll was particularly lengthy, a bureaucratic masterpiece detailing quotas of lentils, goat hair, and something charmingly listed as miscellaneous offerings too squishy to name. And then came the most delicate part, ruling the columns. You may not think that drawing parallel lines on papyrus with a thin reed and no ruler would be worth describing, but for a scribe, this was the thrilling knife edge upon which legibility balanced. One squiggle too far left, and suddenly the High Treasurer's portion of the property record looks like it belonged to the fishmonger downriver. Anen held his breath, leaned in, and drew his guideline with monkish precision. Success, the kind of success one celebrates with a very tiny exhale and a sense of godlike control over vertical space. Just as he reached the grand finale, a flourish under the last quantified item of 3 jars fig wine, unusually fizzy. A shadow fell across the desk. It was Patu, the senior scribe, his brow furrowed in a way that always meant one of 3 things: miscounted offerings, missing livestock, or someone had again tried to bribe the guards with honey cakes. Without a word, Patu reached out and took Anen's scroll, scanning the fine script like a hawk inspecting possible dinner. He gave the faintest grunt of approval, the loudest compliment Patu had bestowed since the year of the record-breaking reed harvest, and handed it back without smudging anything. A good omen. Satisfied, Anen gathered his writing materials into a worn linen satchel, inkpot snugged in its own pouch, reed quills wrapped like sleepy cobras, and a crusty bit of date cake he'd forgotten from breakfast. His work was finished for the day, and he could already hear the soft gurgle of the temple fountain out front, calling to him like a siren made of running water and whispered nap promises. He stepped outside into the warm hush of early evening, his back creaking gently like an old door. One of the novices bowed as he passed. A goat wearing an amulet stared placidly in greeting. Everything around him glowed with the quiet contentment of a day well etched. Anen smiled faintly to himself. Tomorrow would no doubt bring another scroll. More grain inventories, more livestock incidents, possibly another jellybean-shaped temple official demanding an audit. But tonight, he would rest, dreaming of punctuation, papyrus margins, and lines drawn straighter than fate itself. And somewhere deep in the storage archives, A temple cat softly sneezed on a scroll dated 3 reigns ago. As dusk deepened into velvet, Anan made his quiet way toward the scribe's quarters, unaware that the next sunrise would come with a peculiar request, one involving something far more treacherous than barley tallies: temple poetry. The late afternoon sun stretched itself thin across the stone walls of the scriptorium, slanting through narrow windows as if trying not to disturb anyone. The air shimmered faintly with the quiet heat trapped in the limestone, and a single fly buzzed contemplatively near the inkpots, as if it too had a deadline to meet. Gaius, our ever-dedicated scribe, sat straight-backed at his wooden bench that stubbornly creaked with every minor shift of his spine. It was the hour of post-lunch copying, the most dangerous hour in the entire day, not due to any external threat, but rather because this was precisely when food settled, eyelids drooped, and written sentences trailed off mysteriously mid-verb. A great deal of history was accidentally edited during this period, simply because scribes fell asleep mid-scroll. Today's task involved the transcription of an imperial document regarding olive tariffs, a subject so dry one could use it to soak up actual olive oil. The scroll in question described the weight ratios of amphorae against the market value of Tyrian-produced jars, compared to those sourced from Gaul. Scintillating stuff. Gaius's eyes crossed momentarily as he attempted to decipher whether the unit of measure in paragraph 6 was the modius or the sextarius. Such was the high drama of Roman bureaucracy. Still, there was a careful choreography to the work. Quill dipped, excess ink gently tapped off, letters drawn with unwavering patience. Gaius's hands moved like a monk in prayer. After all, any mistake, however tiny, an accidental stroke here, a misplaced accent there, could change harbour tax rebate into something closer to harboured tax rebellion, which, historically speaking, created vastly more paperwork. Now, for those under the impression that ancient scribes weren't monitored, let us introduce Modestus, officially referred to as the overseer of copying accuracy, but more accurately known as the man with a magnifying glass and too much time. His footsteps echoed ominously now down the corridor, a subtle thump-swish-thump dictated rhythmically by his limp and his cape. Capes were quite fashionable in bureaucratic circles, always just a bit too long, perfectly designed to be tripped over. Modestus peered over Gaius's shoulder and gave a grunt of mild approval, the closest he ever came to a compliment. "You nearly mistook a ligature for a full iota," he muttered, eyes squinting. "Catastrophic consequences. Someone in Hispania might mistake a shipment of figs for pigs. You wouldn't want that again, would you?" "Ah, yes. The infamous pig-fig incident of last summer. Whoever says historical documents lack action clearly hasn't read about a small Iberian port town accidentally stockpiling livestock instead of dried fruit." Gaius still shivered at the memory of all those snorting crates. With Modestus lumbering onwards in his eternal hunt for ligature crimes, Gaius returned to his own flurry of parchment and pen. The scent of ink, spiced resin and aged oak oil drifted lazily around him like a moodier cousin of incense. Outside, someone was hammering something to a cart, and the caw of a distant crow reminded everyone within earshot that the exterior world insisted on continuing whether or not their tariffs were correctly filed. Gaius sighed. He recited quietly to himself a favourite truism all scribes knew. "The quill is mightier than the gladius, provided it is sharpened and supervised." With each scroll copied, a little more order was restored to the empire. Or at least, that's what the administration told themselves. In truth, Most of the population never read these scrolls. They lined archives like forgotten recipes, useful once surely, but not anymore. But still, they had to be there, just in case someone ever asked. For variety, Gaius now moved to rubrication, adding red titles and headings to the document. It was an art in itself, requiring a separate ink and an altogether more theatrical flourish. He always liked this part. It was as close as a scribe could come to a signature scent. Your own personal style hidden inside all those margins. Outside, the sun began to dip heavily toward the horizon, a tired peach against terracotta rooftops. Somewhere down in the kitchens, the slow bubbling of lentils hinted at the evening meal. Gaius felt his joints begin to resist further honourable labour, and the idea of warm stew and a flat cushion suddenly held indescribable appeal. He set his quill down, gently, like a sleeping baby bird. The scroll was complete, the fly gone, and even the inkpots had begun to form tiny skins on their surface. Peace had settled into the stone, and as the pages dried, another task, quite different, quietly awaited him. One involving wax tablets and a particularly nosy neighbour with strong opinions about pipe maintenance. But that, dear listener, is a sleepy saga for another evening. Somewhere between the third crow of the rooster and the second yawn of the sun, in a modest clay-walled cottage near the temple wall, our scribe leaned into the awkward bloom of morning with the ceremonial grunt of the overburdened. A scribe's day, you see, didn't begin with fireworks or glory. It began with carefully untying a knotted sandaled heel, rubbing a smear of ink from under the eye, and fishing a pebble from the bedsack. Another rousing start to a truly underappreciated career in bureaucracy. This particular day was market month, day 17 in the calendar of the Old Kingdom, also known by scribes as please don't forget to record the poultry toll day. Somewhere in the grand design of Egyptian civilization, amid pyramid building and divine decrees, someone had to record how many chickens had been carried across the causeway into the spice district, and that someone, lucky in life, if not in posture, was our dear rectangular-shouldered scribe. Before quills and paper, before ballpoints and ergonomic keyboards, there was the steady scratch of reed on papyrus. This scratch was not the romantic hiss you might expect, but more of a ragged hiss, shuffle hiss, like a lizard reading in the dark. The reed pen, trimmed just so with a knife sharp enough to impress any youthful apprentice, was dipped delicately into a palette. Red ink for headings, black ink for body text, Times New hieroglyphic. Today's task was transcribing a list of storage inventories from the granary near the Temple of Ptah. Grain, glorious grain, the cornerstone of any ancient diet, and the most dreadfully dull of all items to measure. Yet every sack had to be weighed, every handful counted, as if each grain would be personally offended to go unacknowledged by the record. In hushed tones muffled by papyrus dust, the overseer droned, 17 1/4 sacks of emmer from the western plot. The scribe, unblinking, carefully etched the number beside the standard glyph for emmer. That glyph, by the way, is a surprisingly polite sprig with a chevron hat. Historical modesty. The Egyptians had it in spades. Outside, market bells drifted faintly into the record room, the soft clang suggesting something more enthusiastic than granary math. Offerings of leather, dates, clay lamps, and the occasional argument over fish prices. But the scribe, devoted soldier of scroll and ink, remained where duty clutched him most tightly, hunched over a tilting desk, ankle half asleep, with a persistent crumb of barley stuck stubbornly in the hem of his tunic. At midday, silence fell with the precision of a sundial shadow. Time for the ceremonial midday break, a feast of tepid water and a modest lentil loaf wrapped in linen. The scribe did not complain. Lentils may not dazzle the eye, but they rarely insult the constitution. Besides, every earnest bite was a reminder that a body well fed writes better hieroglyphs. In theory. After the break came the recalibrated afternoon ritual, the noble art of recopying something you just wrote because a fly landed on the last glyph and you smudged it. Scribes were the unsung heroes of ancient version control. A single crooked owl glyph could change tax exemption to tax explosion, a fate no nobleman wished to see inscribed beside his name on the wall of posterity, or legal binding contract. In the final hour, as the sun prepared its slow descent into Nile-adjacent poetry, the scribe reviewed his day's work, a neat column of figures, names, and the occasional beetle symbol, no doubt placed there with symbolic intent, unless of course a live beetle paid a visit. Either way, the page was now complete. Carefully, the scrolls were rolled and tied, stacked like tendrils of knowledge, or perhaps ignored shopping lists. A soft breeze tiptoed through the slatted window, flirting briefly with the edges of the page, then retreating as if embarrassed. The scribe gently wiped his ink-stained fingers, mindful of the sacredness of both scroll and palm, then rose with the creaky resolution only a truly fulfilled bureaucrat can know. Tomorrow, perhaps, the scrolls would be delivered to the temple archive or to the official storeroom supervisor, who may or may not read them before filing them under future reference, never. But for now, the day folded away like a linen cloth at sundown. And just beyond the amber horizon, as the stars began their whispering ascent, another duty loomed that only a scribe could perform, preparing the wax seals for the official grain account, an ode to accounting that would be whispered beneath oil lamps and between spoonfuls of lentil stew. But that, my dear sleeper of thoughts and listener of ancient lore, is a matter for another soft-spoken twilight. The sun had just begun its leisurely descent, casting a syrupy amber glow across the dusty courtyard of the scribal quarters. Creaking wooden shutters shifted in the warm breeze like half-lily-lidded eyes, catching the fading light and fanning the scent of parchment and old ink into the evening air. The day was not quite over, nor was it energetic enough to begin something new. A perfect in-between sort of hour. And in the world of scribes, this was prime time for brushing. Yes, quill brushing. After a long day of transcribing tax records, legal decrees, and the occasional unsolicited poem slipped in by a romantic underscribe, our dear scribe, Amenhotep, carried out the sacred daily ritual of quill maintenance with a reverence usually reserved for religious rites or a particularly persnickety librarian. He sat cross-legged on his reed mat, squinting slightly in the softening light, his lap full of goose feathers. Now, one might assume a scribe's quill was a simple matter. Pluck it from the bird, dip it in ink, write tragic letters home about grain shortages. But, much like anything in the ancient world that involved the upper middle class, it was far more ceremonial than that. First came the trimming. Each feather had to be carved to a nib just fine enough to write in the compact, elegant demotic script, yet sturdy enough to last several lines before fraying at the tip, like a papyrus bookmark in a toddler's mouth. Amenhotep hummed to himself, an old hymn, slightly off-key, as he sharpened the edge of his favorite quill with a bronze penknife. This one had a slight curve, a natural flair that lent itself beautifully to write the looping tales of the Egyptian Nefer, meaning beauty or goodness, depending on context or local priestly mood swings. All proper scribes knew at least one excessively detailed way to praise a word. It was how they flirted with language, their one true indulgence amid a life of copying receipts for barley transactions. He tested the quill on a scrap of cartonnage left over from some failed inscribed amulet order. The stroke was smooth, satisfying, like butter, if butter could file your taxes. To his left, a small clay bowl of water waited quietly, its surface barely rippling as he dipped each freshly trimmed quill to soften the fibers. The water carried the faint scent of lotus petals, having borrowed the floral remains from the temple next door. Waste not, want not, even if that not wanting referred specifically to an offering now used to soak bird feathers instead of please the gods. Once the quills were groomed and tested, Amenhotep moved to ink mixing. Despite popular imagination, ancient Egyptian ink wasn't just black goo in a pot. No, sir. Making ink was an art form, a chemical ballet of soot, gum arabic, and water proportions argued about in hushed, scholarly tones over many an overboiled lentil stew. Tonight's batch was to be jet black, a classic choice and, frankly, the little black dress of Egyptian calligraphy. He stirred the soot slowly, folding in a splash of water and a dash of tree sap resin until the mixture gleamed like crow feathers in moonlight. He sniffed it approvingly. Not too runny, not too chalky, positively inky. With tools aligned and quills standing upright in their little holder, a salvaged date pit cup now retired from snacking duty, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. The courtyard's shadows were growing longer, swaying gently as if the buildings themselves were growing sleepy. From the far end of the compound, someone began reciting passages of the Book of the Dead, mostly for practice, but perhaps with a hint of hope too, just in case the afterlife demanded good handwriting. Amenhotep smiled softly. It was almost time for nightfall duties, which included wrapping the inkstones in linen squares, sweeping beetle carcasses off the seated cushions, those little scarab rascals loved to nestle, and performing the formal closing ritual of locking the scroll cabinet with exactly 3 muttered blessings and 1 annoyed grunt. The life of a scribe was repetitive, yes, but it held rhythms as comforting as the Nile's current, and just as essential, at least to those who liked their laws written down and their love letters legible. With his tools cleaned and his lap free of feather fluff, Amenhotep rose, joints popping like discreet punctuation. He stretched toward the heavens, careful not to tip the ink, and padded across the room to check the scroll rack, ensuring no one had misfiled a milk inventory in the legal decrees again. That mistake last month had nearly caused a riot in the Goat District. Outside, the last streaks of sunlight painted the walls honey gold before slipping into the cool embrace of twilight, where stars began to fuss about, adjusting their places in the sky, like dancers late to rehearsal. And as the evening deepened, overhead the first bats took flight, tiny, flitting commas against the night's expanse. Amenhotep set about preparing the parchment for a new task at dawn, a task which naturally began with tea and something mildly bland. The pale morning light tiptoed through the high, narrow windows of the scriptorium, as if it too were wary of waking the building's quiet inhabitants. The air was cool, still touched with the bite of night, and the faintest scent of ink, parchment, and yesterday's waxed candle smoke lingered like a tired librarian's sigh. Our scribe, let's call him Lucius, as he still refuses to pick a stage name, began his day precisely as he had the day before, and the day before that, and frankly, the day before last harvest festival as well, with the same reverent stretch, the same dissatisfied scratching of his scalp, and the same well-practiced groan that mysteriously matched the croak of the monastery's old wooden benches. After all, being a scribe was not a profession for the spontaneous. Excitement was measured in very small units, micro size, parchment curls, and the appearance of a letter Z, which seldom came up in Latin texts and was therefore considered a rare treat. Lucius shuffled to his assigned desk, a finely crafted wooden contraption complete with built-in inkwell, a candle sconce, and a slightly uneven leg that had won several unofficial, most likely to induce tilting awards. Setting down his freshly trimmed quills, the quill-keeping schedule was as sacred as the Psalter, he gave a brief glance to his working manuscript. It was, today, yet another copy of De Agricultura by Cato the Elder, a text so dry it might as well have come pre-desiccated. Cato had opinions, yes, that's opinions with a capital brushstroke, on vegetables, manure, family morality, and the proper sequence for cleaning one's feet. Nothing made Lucius yearn for sleep like Cato's impassioned plea for strategic cabbage cultivation. Still, a scribe's job was holy work, or at the very least, wholly adjacent. Copying the wisdom of ancient Romans with unwavering precision meant preserving civilization, one ink blot at a time. And so, Lucius dipped his nib into ink, listening to the soft scratch of quill on parchment, a sound not unlike a very small mouse dragging a leaf across a tile floor. He tried again to find the rhythm. Dip, flick, stroke. Start to finish, he copied. Si hortum habs, omnia tibi dirent, which Cato, in his philosophical veggie glow, purported meant, if you have a garden, you have everything. Lucius paused, slightly doubtful. He once had a garden. Rabbits had everything. The scriptorium around him buzzed with a near-silent symphony of scribblers. Brother Marcus was 2 desks down, copying psalms and occasionally mouthing the words to ensure accuracy, though more likely to practice his dramatic whisper voice for later recitation. Sister Aurelia, meanwhile, had boldly switched to using red ink for illuminated initials, giving B's and D's the flair of high cathedral drama. Rumour had it she was planning gold leaf next week. Scandalous. As the noon bell swayed into the air, off-pitch but charming, the scribes briefly lifted their heads, blinking as if surprised by the presence of gravity and time. Lunch would be a modest affair, stale bread softened by cheese or vice versa if they were lucky. Perhaps a fig, if the storage cellar hadn't turned it into an abstract sculpture of mould. Lucius tucked his quill behind his ear, a hazardous gesture given the ink, but ritual demanded elan. He wiped his fingers on the hem of his wool tunic, which served unofficially as napkin, blotting cloth, and occasional moth habitat, then shuffled toward the refectory. As he walked, his mind wandered, not to adventure or fame, but to the quiet satisfaction of scrolling an unbroken sentence across flawlessly lined parchment. The way capital letters sat proudly at paragraph heads like small kings atop their alphabetical thrones. How punctuation, though fledgling at best, was beginning to flutter its wings in some texts. He harboured a quiet love for the semicolon, though nobody quite understood how to use it yet, not even the semicolon. Outside the stone corridors, the world might be bustling with wars, trades, plagues, and marriages of political inconvenience. But in here, everything moved at the steady, drowsy pace of ink on page. History unfurled in looping, careful lines, and the scribe was both witness and transcriber of a world slightly too big to hold in one's head. so instead they held it in words. After a rewardingly lukewarm bowl of something that once aspired to be soup, Lucius returned to the scriptorium. Calmness settled once more, like dust motes descending in beams of light. Dip, flick, stroke. Somewhere in the margin, a correction waited. Perhaps a monk had spelled patience with an extra vowel, or maybe he'd accidentally illuminated a fish inside a letter O. Whatever it was, Lucius would tend to it, gently, with care. And as the candlelight returned to dance across the desks, our devoted scribe began to lose himself again in the alphabetic ritual, dreaming, perhaps, of cabbage, commas, or the faint possibility of a slightly less uneven desk. The bell would toll again, eventually, and with it, a new discovery in the lost art of being completely, gloriously boring. But before that, let's have one more letter, shall we? The dusty warmth of the scriptorium had mellowed by mid-afternoon, like bread left too long near the hearth, crusty, dry, and faintly fragrant. The sun angled low through warped glass panes, casting long, lazy rectangles across the cluttered writing tables. Parchments curled at the edges like sleepy cats, and inkpots bore the crusty signatures of overuse. It was now that our humble scribe, Everard, typically entered his most precarious daily dilemma, the management of a growling stomach. Everard's mid-afternoon hunger arrived with the precision of a monastic bell. It was not so much a roar as a gentle reminder, more polite than a nobleman, and more persistent than a tossed pebble in a shoe. Lunch, once consumed hours ago with the fanfare appropriate to hard crusts and lukewarm pottage, had long retreated into the foggy depths of digestion. The human body, noble temple though it may be, doesn't run on ink alone. Now, contrary to popular imagination, medieval scribes were not casually handed snacks by robed assistants or drifted through their working hours puffing on grapes and cheese like ink-stained Roman emperors. No, Everard's options were more, how shall we put it, creative. Hidden beneath his writing bench was a cloth-wrapped packet containing his emergency hoard, a shriveled apple, 3 questionable hazelnuts, and, for true indulgence, a hardened crust of dark rye bread that once witnessed the reign of Henry II. Aware that Brother Matthew, the senior scribe and entirely humorless, abhorred the sound of chewing as fiercely as he feared papal audits, Everard developed a method of silent consumption. He had trained his jaw to move with the ghostly grace of parchment turning, and he could tuck a bit of stale rye against his molars without alerting his neighbour. Of course, no food eaten surreptitiously is ever satisfying. That's what makes it exciting, sort of like espionage, but with less cloak and more crumb. As he worked, copying a particularly uninspired sermon on the virtues of humility, penned by an abbot with an obvious fondness for repetition, Everard let his mind wander. What if scribes had unionized, he wondered, as his nib scratched out yet another use of the phrase mortal vanity, better wages, lunchtime scribal symposia, and perhaps, he dared hope, a second ration of ale. There could be grievance ledgers, neatly catalogued complaints about quills too spiky, desks too splintery, and monks excessively flatulent. But this was all fantasy, of course. In reality, the monastic world had no suggestion box, unless you counted the confession booth. His work that afternoon required not just careful handwriting, but also decorating the capital letters, what one might now call font design, except instead of a computer program, he used a squirrel hairbrush and unimaginable patience. The G in Gloria boasted a small fish swallowing a snail. This flourish didn't symbolize anything. Everard just liked tiny ecosystem dramas. Of course, it wasn't always appreciated. Once, in a fit of mischief, he added a pig snout in profile to a marginal angel. When questioned, he explained it as a symbol of divine humility. The prior remained unconvinced, but the evidence had already been bound with vellum and shelved for eternity. As the shadows stretched like lazy monks across the stone floor. Everard glanced up at the painted frescoes above. The saints were still staring beatifically downward, as they had for 100 years. He wondered if they ever got bored of watching scribes wrestle inkblots and daydream. By now, his script was beginning to slip into that graceful tiredness that sometimes made it lovelier. Fatigued letters seemed to stretch their limbs, dotting their eyes with theatrical flair, or swooning into S curves like sleepy dancers. Fatigue, it turned out, had a style all its own. Brother Matthew announced the late prayer bell with his usual stony cheer. Everard tucked away his brush, rolled up the ill-tempered sermon, and stood with a creak that seemed to emerge alternately from his knees and the stool. His fingers were stained with ink in a pattern that by now resembled a deliberate tattoo. Tiny constellations of blots connecting months of labor. As he left the scriptorium, the fading sun glimmered on the cooling stones, casting golden stripes over the walkways like some medieval zebra crossing. The monastery kitchen might still have warm cider left, and if no one was watching, Everard could fashion a tiny toast with that rye chip he had heroically tucked back into his sleeve. Further down the corridor waited the evening tasks. But first, a brief moment of firelight, cider, and thoughts of illuminated fish with unknowable motivations. We'll follow him there, into the quiet warmth and the soft scratch of evening routines. While the townspeople of Alexandria bustled and barked their way toward midday tasks, bakers setting out their modest loaves and fishmongers arguing loudly with gulls. A certain scribe sat, unmoved, beneath the predictable comfort of a fig tree's shade. Our scribe, whose love for ink rivaled that of small cats for sun patches, had a most pressing task today, copying 16 lines from a temple inventory scroll onto a fresh sheet of papyrus, the kind of work that made one feel both important and profoundly sleepy, often at once. The inventory scroll itself was hardly breathless reading. It listed temple items with such thrilling notations as 2 bronze bowls, mildly dented, used in incense rituals, 1 jug, disputed origin, possible regift, 3 ceremonial sandals, left foot only. Scribal records had this knack, you see, making even divine rituals sound like an exceptionally boring estate sale. With his reed pen in hand, our scribe dipped it gently into a pot of inky black, made from soot, gum, and the kind of water clever people boiled first. Wisdom, after all, often sat in the small, quiet decisions, like never trusting Nile water raw. The pen scratched softly against the papyrus, a rustle like a whisper, while the scribe's eyebrows did all the visible emotional work, rising slightly at a particularly ambiguous hieroglyph, furrowing at an awkward spacing error. Mistakes, in his trade, were not to be taken lightly. An incorrect symbol could turn a ceremonial sandal into a sacred serpent, and neither priest nor serpents were known for taking jokes well. But what truly challenged the discipline of a scribe on such a warm afternoon wasn't the risk of divine footwear confusion. It was lunch. The scent of roasted lentils floated through the columns, and the echoes of a stray fig hitting the ground somewhere nearby served as a dreamy percussion against his mild hunger. This led, of course, to brief scribal philosophizing. Could one eat lentils and scribe at once? Wasn't that too many hands of activity for a two-handed being? This led to a break, a deliberate one, which is, of course, a very different thing from a nap taken with a pen still in hand. Still seated, the scribe unpacked his modest lunch, a small chunk of barley bread, slightly cracked from both age and dignity, a handful of dates he'd bartered for with an extremely persuasive boy, and a piece of cheese of unknowable lineage. It smelled sharp, a sort of edible proverb. He chewed in rhythmic silence, watching a beetle navigate a groove in the sandstone floor. The beetle, by all appearances, was headed somewhere important, probably to file some form. As his meal wound down, our scribe noted a visiting priest walking past, nodding in polite recognition. Now, this priest, whose name likely meant something dramatic like "he who speaks with clouds," wore the distinct expression of someone inventing a new religious title for himself. Probably assistant keeper of lamps or overseer of the lesser incense drawer. Such roles were common, especially when a priest wanted slightly more prestige and slightly fewer duties. Returning to the scroll, the scribe frowned at a line he couldn't recall writing. "Beware the jars marked with the laughing ibex." Ah, yes, that had been a joke from another scribe. A prank preserved forever in temple archives, scaring future readers into imagining mischievous goats and cursed pottery. Scribes had their own secret society, you see, known informally as the Order of Marginal Notes. Their oaths bound them to clarity, to truth, and occasionally to mischief. Afternoon proceeded with the gentle regularity of a cat licking its paw, both precise and hopelessly repetitive. The ink dried, the lines aligned, and the page began to look less like work and more like history, quietly whispering itself into permanence. As the fig tree offered slightly deeper shadows, the scribe stretched his back with a groan and admired his handiwork, meticulously dull, elegantly accurate, just the way civilization liked it. Out in the courtyard, a soft breeze lifted the edge of another scroll someone had left too close to a draft, and someone else, possibly a junior scribe, could be heard muttering about missing symbols and those cursed ink-smudge demons. The sun slipped lower behind the temple's outer walls, casting sacred colonnades in longer and longer lines, like unwritten sentences still waiting to be composed. The scribe, gently gathering his tools, tucked the completed copy beneath his arm and began the short walk back, his sandals scuffing rhythmically, like the final punctuation of a useful but thoroughly uneventful masterpiece. And so, as the scent of dinner fires awakened in distant courtyards and a chorus of lowing oxen signaled the gates of the day slowly closing, he paused one last time to admire the simplicity of the things we rarely notice. A full stylus jar, an empty stomach no longer grumbling, and the unmatched joy of leaving just one line unwritten. Until tomorrow. Let us follow that silence now, with our eyes half closed and our curiosity gently intoxicated, as the ink of another temple mystery, far more mundane, even more marvelous, waits to be uncorked. The early dusk had begun its subtle descent, tinting the stone walls of the scribal chamber with that syrupy amber hue, the kind that makes even a crooked quill look poetic. Leonidas, ever the diligent scribe, had just finished his 11th wax tablet of the day, composed entirely of tax records so repetitive they could lull a Pythagorean into a Gregorian chant. He sat for a moment in rare repose, rolling his shoulders with a cartoonish creak. Not the kind of sound that history books record, but if you listened closely, you could almost hear the collective groan of Roman clavicles echoing through time. he dipped his fingers into a bit of scented oil, lavender, favoured by those scribes with both aching wrists and an inflated sense of olfactory refinement, and rubbed it gently onto his hands. This ointment had been gifted to the scribes by a physician in training named Brutus Minor, who insisted it soothed inflammation and warded off quill rot, a condition he most certainly invented for business purposes. The scribes suspected the mixture was just sheep fat with a generous pinch of dried weeds, but given the alternatives, namely nothing, they accepted the lard-laced salvation with both skepticism and gratitude. Outside, the forum was beginning to quiet. The vendors rolled down their awnings, market criers announced the final discount on eel pies, and the baker's apprentice performed his nightly act of heroic futility, attempting to sweep flour dust off cobblestones already white as Saturn's beard. Leonidas turned his attention to his final task of the day, a transcription of a local senator's speech about aqueduct pressure improvements. Truly, if oratory could drip, this one came out like stale barley porridge. Still, he applied himself with monkish dedication. Every lackluster metaphor was faithfully inked, every tedious clause etched with the same focus one might reserve for inscribing the history of gods. He paused only once, to yawn so enormously that the cat hiding under his bench mistook it as a signal to flee. The cat, known unofficially among scribes as scribbles, had adopted the chamber months ago. No one fed him directly, as it might invite more, and yet he thrived, sustained almost entirely, it seemed, by dust motes and the occasional protesting spider. Scribbles circled the bench once more and settled on a discarded cloak, purring in rhythm with the scratching of the quill, a kind of warm, feline metronome. On the windowsill, a wax tablet cooled in the evening breeze, the words upon it capturing an invoice for amphora storage that would no doubt outlive emperor and empire alike. Such was the irony of the scribe's existence: to render permanent the fleeting, to elevate the eternally unimportant. Somewhere, buried in vaulted archives or forgotten beneath the amphitheatre stairs, these records would hibernate for centuries, only to be rediscovered by modern scholars and occasionally misinterpreted as ancient poetry. A torch was lit near the outer door, casting flickering shadows that danced like toga-clad ghosts across the walls. Leonidas took it as a cue for closure. He cleaned the nib of his stylus with the diligence of someone who truly believed cleanliness was next to deification, and capped his ink with a reverence bordering on religious. The other scribes had already dispersed, no doubt lured away by the possibility of lentil stew and idle gossip about grain prices. But Leonidas lingered. He watched as the firelight dimmed inside the chamber and let his eyes travel to the ceiling, painted long ago with cracking frescoes, a half-forgotten pantheon of supervising deities and quality control gods. His favorite was a lesser-known guardian spirit named Eraticus, depicted with crossed eyes and a scroll unraveling into chaos. He supposedly protected scribes from disastrous ink spills and mild plagiarism. Leonidas gave a tiny salute in Eraticus's direction and gathered his things. The stylus went into his satchel with the same solemnity a soldier might reserve for sheathing a sword. Scribbles, upon hearing the shuffle of exiting footsteps, leapt indifferently off the cloak and resumed his nightly patrol of crumb hunting. Outside, twilight had rolled over the rooftops like a cosmic blanket, and the air held that meditative hush only a city of tired bureaucrats could produce. As he passed the fig tree near the gate, now nearly bare of fruit, the moon just peeked over the wall, soft and spectral. All was in order. Aqueducts still flowed, taxes still rose, and the ink, ever obedient, still etched the ordinary into legend. And just as Leonidas reached for the latch to close the chamber door behind him, the distant sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the calm. A young messenger, bounding up the steps with a scroll in hand, and a look of someone who'd rather be doing quite literally anything else. Another task, not even a spectacular one, just a parchment plea for more parchment. But that, dear listener, would be a story for another dreamy moment. The sun, now blushing beneath a veil of dusk, stretched its golden fingers over the rooftops of our Scribe's sleepy village, casting long, soft shadows on cobbled streets and chicken-littered courtyards. The day was winding down, not dramatically, not with a shout or trumpet, but with the slow exhalation of parchment and people who had done their tiny jobs well and wanted a bit of barley stew and a warm stone to rest their back against. Inside the scribal quarters, a place that smelled faintly of ink, beeswax, and a faint whiff of goat, our faithful scribe was tidying up his workstation. The desk, once a battlefield of scattered scrolls, inkpots, and half-eaten dates with suspicious teeth marks, was now mostly neat. Mostly. A stubborn ink blot had taken up permanent residence in the top right corner of his working space, like some mischievous gremlin, daring any rag or sponge to expel it. Nearby, his reed pen was being lovingly cleaned with a damp cloth, an act of affection usually reserved for pets or spiritual relics, but which, for a scribe, held no less reverence. The pen was his tool, his companion, and sometimes, when the inkwell tipped over onto his lap, his sworn enemy. After all, the life of a scribe wasn't dramatic, but it was intimate. He spent his hours whispering to parchment, tickling history into permanence with every careful stroke. He got to know the quirks of certain scrolls, the way one batch of papyrus liked to curl inward like a shy guest, or how another had a chewy texture like stale peter, resisting the ink as if it were allergic to vowels. As twilight deepened, the scribe took a candle from the shelf, its wax having already draped itself in lazy cascades down the side like a sleeping cat, and carefully lit it. The flame flickered, casting a golden glow over his final task of the evening, copying a humble list of items for the temple's granary inventory. The items were, in no uncertain order, magnificently boring. Barley, 17 sacks, lentils, 6 amphorae, goat cheeses, small and vaguely aggressive, 4 wheels. The list read not so much like a poem as a menu from a particularly tedious rustic inn. But to the scribe, each stroke brought satisfaction. These lists didn't just mark the logistics of lentils. They whispered stories, tales of harvests survived, goats herded without incident, and stores prepared for the unknown cruelties of winter. Each scribble was, in its own humble way, a prayer for continued mundanity. Outside his modest window, stars began to prick their way into the indigo sky, and a cicada struck up its solemn commentary, as if auditioning for the role of ambience coordinator. The scribe paused for a moment, listening. Not to the bug. He'd heard enough of that particular soloist to fill a lifetime. But to the silence beyond it. It was that kind of silence that ancient philosophers once mistook for the music of the spheres. To the scribe, it was simply the joy of not being asked to rewrite something again in darker ink. He leaned back in his creaky chair, which sighed under the weight of a job done, not perfectly, but respectfully well. He looked over at the storage alcove where his scrolls now sat like plump caterpillars resting after a long crawl through bureaucracy. Some bore the seals of nobility, while others were destined to be read exactly once by an administrator named Hespu, who yawned through everything with the fierce commitment of a barn cat in the sun. The scribe reached for the ceramic mug of watered beer he'd stashed behind a dusty shelf, one of the few indulgences of his trade, besides daydreaming of papyrus that never tears under the pen. He took a sip, the warmth of it slipping down like liquid dusk, and exhaled. That small, quiet joy of finishing something, of winding down without ceremony, was not unlike standing on the edge of a lake at dawn and watching the surface smooth itself. Tomorrow would bring more lists, more letters, and likely more requests for duplicate copies in 5 different scripts. Royal demands tended to escalate in complexity proportional to the boredom of the court involved. But for now, the scribe let his eyes drift, the candlelight softening at the edges, the air thick with sleep and ink and ease, and somewhere beyond that window, just down the road and around the dusty bend, a donkey brayed, perhaps a little too proudly for someone who'd spent the entire day standing still. That, the scribe thought to himself with a chuckle, was the true sound of civilization. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster, not quite understanding how time works, let out an optimistic crow. The candle flickered low, and the moment lingered, patiently waiting for what came next. The wax had cooled by dusk, and with it, so had the pace of the day. Outside, the marketplace babbled in slow-mo, sellers half-heartedly haggling over figs and gossip. But inside the modest stone chamber, our scribe's sanctum, the atmosphere was dipped in a soft kind of amber, the golden hush of evening script work. A single oil lamp flickered on the wooden desk, its flame moving in time with the whisper of reed bristles against parchment. The air smelled faintly of ink, aging scrolls, and whatever cheese had been forgotten near the window. Our dear scribe, whose back had begun protesting around mid-afternoon, straightened for a moment, cracked his knuckles with a ceremonial flair, and resumed his transcription of a local noble's tax record, an entry so dry it could be used to blot out soup. He didn't mind. Boring was, after all, his bread and barley. Precision was meditation, and silence his most talkative friend. Somewhere in the corner, the family cat, named Hesi-Ra, after the famous Old Kingdom scribe, because of course, performed her 87th bath of the day, pausing only occasionally to blink at ghosts, real or imagined. Tonight's task was to copy official land deeds onto the finer papyrus, using his court script, which was a marginally fancier version of his shopping list script. The chief difference lay in the boldness of certain hieratic curves that held more legal weight than some pharaoh's proclamations. That little swoop on the water ripple symbol, practically a signature. His wife, who made strong beer and even stronger remarks, passed by with a bowl of lentil stew. She didn't say anything. She just raised her eyebrows in a fashion that succinctly conveyed, "That better be your last scroll for the night." He nodded. She nodded. It was a marital waltz performed nightly between inkblot and dinnerpot. Outside the shutters, the moon was rising like an old coin, tarnished, steady, somehow poetic in its habitual return. The Nile's waters reflected it back, ripples etching silver calligraphy into the silt-dark current. And if rivers could read, surely they would have appreciated the symmetry. Our scribe paused again. His hand ached, the special kind of ache known only to those who have ever written 3 names that sound nearly identical, but legally are not. He reached for his vial of myrrh resin. It helped, supposedly, with writer's cramps and the mood swings incurred by prolonged exposure to bureaucratic language. He took a deep whiff. It did not help. Still, he smiled, because there was something undeniably charming about being a cog in the great dusty wheel of empire, especially when that cog had neat penmanship and knew how to spell procurement grain surplus without hesitation. In the corner, Hesi Ra leapt up onto the windowsill, knocking over the cup of unused ink. Fortunately, it was the cheap batch, more water than soot. The cat gave a little chirrup of self-congratulation and settled in to watch the moon assert its influence. Finishing the final line with a flourish, our scribe set down the reed brush and reached for the small clay seal, pressing it into the wax beside the script's end. The design was a crude scarab, his personal mark. Official documents needed identity after all, and who better to verify land taxes due than a bug? He leaned back. The room held that soft stillness that only comes when all things have been said and scribed. The stew was cooling, the cat was purring, and the night slipped further into itself like a folded tapestry. So he gathered his tools into their linen wrappings, pale cloth somehow always dirtied at the corner, and tucked the scroll into a reed basket. Tomorrow would bring fresh ink, fresh grievances about barley tariffs, and likely another noble concerned that his neighbour's goats were trespassing with malicious intent. But for tonight, the day's words had been weighed and recorded. The silence had been written into, and the world, crooked, dusty, terribly administrative, felt just organised enough to sleep in. He blew out the lamp, and everything turned sepia dark once more. Sleep well, historian.